The silence at the border checkpoint was always unsettling, but this morning it felt fundamentally different. The kind of different that makes your nervous system scream warnings your conscious mind hasn't processed yet. I stood at the customs window, watching the empty road stretch toward the horizon on both sides, the American asphalt to my left melting into heat shimmer and dust devils that spun lazily in the distance, the Mexican side to my right equally barren, and still under the unrelenting sun. The thermometer mounted outside the processing building read 127 degrees Fahrenheit. Not that temperature mattered anymore. I couldn't remember the last time a vehicle had passed through this checkpoint. 3 days? 4? Maybe 5. The distinction had stopped mattering around day 2, when the radio chatter shifted abruptly from routine traffic reports and commercial advertisements to fragmented emergency broadcasts that cut in and out like dying signals. Fragments of words that made no sense until they suddenly made all the sense in the world. My name is Marcus Webb. I've worked this checkpoint for 12 years, not because I had some burning passion for border security or immigration protocol, but because it was stable work that paid reasonably well and required minimal thought after the initial training period. The job had become muscle memory, the kind of work you could accomplish while your mind drifted elsewhere, thinking about what you'd cook for dinner or whether your truck needed an oil change. I knew every groove in the concrete floor of the processing building, could navigate it blindfolded. I knew every squeaky hinge on the gate mechanisms, the specific mechanical sound each one made depending on how fast you opened it. I knew the way the southern barrier settled at dusk when the temperature dropped, creating a metallic creak that echoed across the checkpoint facilities. I knew that Miguel, who worked the Mexican side, always brought his wife's tamales on Tuesdays, always homemade, always still warm in the plastic container, and complained about his knees every Wednesday without fail. I knew Officer Daniels from the American shift spent his break time reading Western novels in his truck, always the same paperback series, and always bought the same brand of coffee from the duty-free shop, regular medium roast, never black, always with 2 sugars. I knew this place the way you know your own home after living there for over a decade. That intimate familiarity with surroundings that makes you invisible to their actual significance. You stop seeing what's around you because you've seen it too many times. The checkpoint had become background noise in my life. Scenery that registered but didn't engage. Then the world stopped turning, and I finally started seeing the first indication that something fundamental was changing came through the radio. On day 1, the standard traffic communications were replaced by periodic emergency alerts. Nothing clear, just fragments that repeated, "Advise all personnel to maintain stations," and "Reports of civil unrest in metropolitan areas," and "All citizens should remain indoors." The alerts were bureaucratic, formal, written in the language of official procedure. On day 2, the chatter became noticeably more urgent and significantly less coherent. Words kept repeating in different combinations. Outbreak, containment, do not approach, stay indoors, mandatory evacuation. The tone of the broadcasters had shifted from professional calm to barely controlled panic. On day 3, I tried calling my supervisor in El Paso and got nothing but a dead line that didn't even have the courtesy of a busy signal. Just absolute silence. Dead air. The complete absence of any sound suggesting the entire telephone infrastructure was collapsing systematically. By day 4, the radio had gone almost completely silent except for occasional bursts of automated distress signals that seemed to loop continuously, playing the same message over and over, without any acknowledgement that anyone was listening. That's when I understood what was actually happening. The structure holding everything together had fractured completely, and I was standing directly in the center of that fracture, at a border checkpoint in the middle of nowhere with no way out and no one coming to relieve me. The checkpoint sat at mile marker 287, positioned in the Texas borderlands where the nearest functioning town was 40 miles away in either direction. Not close enough to evacuate toward, not remote enough to feel isolated from what was happening. The facility had been built like a fortress, though no one had called it that when I started working here. These places are engineered with specific logic that comes from decades of thinking about security and control. Concrete barriers positioned to control vehicle flow and prevent ramming attacks. Heavy steel gates that could be locked down in seconds through electronic systems. Guard towers at each corner providing elevated sightlines and defensive positions. A processing building flanked by administrative structures and maintenance facilities. Everything was designed around a single principle: control movement. Inspect people. Decide who crosses and who doesn't. In 12 years of working here, taking my paychecks, going through the motions of security procedures that mostly involved waving vehicles through, I'd never imagined that the entire infrastructure would become exactly what it was designed to prevent. A last refuge for survivors. A place where the barrier meant something entirely different from its original purpose. The first person to reach the checkpoint after everything started collapsing was a man named Marcus Hendricks. He came from the American side in a pickup truck that had clearly been driven hard, the driver's door torn completely off its hinges and hanging loose, the bed loaded with supplies that looked like he'd been gathering them frantically. Canned food, plastic water jugs, ammunition boxes, a first aid kit that had been ransacked and torn open. His face was hollowed out, aged beyond his actual years by something that looked like pure terror mixed with adrenaline exhaustion. His skin gray and clammy. He didn't have identification on him, didn't seem interested in protocol or paperwork or any of the bureaucratic nonsense that had governed this checkpoint for 12 years. He was bleeding from a wound on his arm that looked unmistakably like teeth marks. Deep punctures, the kind that no ordinary animal leaves. Arranged in a pattern that suggested something with a jaw structure wrong enough to make your hindbrain activate its alarm systems. "You need to lock this place down," he said. Not as a request or suggestion, but as a statement of objective fact, his voice hoarse from screaming or thirst or both. "Right now. Today, they're coming and they're moving fast." I asked him what he meant, which, in retrospect, was a stupid question. He laughed, not the sound of someone amused or slightly unhinged, but the sound of someone whose sense of reality had been fundamentally destroyed and was trying to cope by finding dark humor in the situation. He told me about the outbreak in El Paso, described it spreading through the city blocks in what felt like days. Military had pulled back and abandoned positions. Police had stopped responding to calls. People were evacuating in every direction simultaneously, creating gridlock and chaos. He described bodies in the streets that continued moving after they should have been dead, not twitching or convulsing, but purposefully mobile, driven by something that looked like hunger or compulsion. He described sounds he couldn't quite categorize, something between a human scream and an animal's croak, a vocalization that seemed designed to activate something primal in your nervous system, a survival instinct that screamed danger and run, and now. I wanted to dismiss him as panicked, as someone whose mind had broken under stress, but his arm was actively bleeding, the wound showing clear signs of infection already spreading, red lines running up toward his shoulder. The bite marks were real. I could count the tooth impressions, could see the bruising pattern around each puncture. Whatever had bitten him wasn't a dog or a wild animal. The spacing was wrong for anything in nature. I locked him in one of the holding cells in the processing building's detention section. Not out of cruelty or fear, but because protocol existed for situations like this. Quarantine, isolation, observation, prevent contamination of the general population. He didn't resist or demand release. He seemed relieved to have concrete walls between himself and the open road. I radioed for medical support from the nearest facility, already knowing the answer before making the call. The radio confirmed my expectations with nothing but static, and the occasional automated loop that had probably been running unattended for hours. The next person arrived 2 days later, Miguel. He came from the Mexican side on foot around sunset, having abandoned his car 30 miles back when it ran out of fuel. He'd heard the reports on the radio before the networks collapsed completely, understood what the emergency broadcasts were describing, and had made the decision to come to the checkpoint because it represented something. Structure, control, a place where someone still maintained authority. He brought his family documents, his vaccination records, his passport, all the things that had mattered in the old world's bureaucratic framework. None of it was relevant anymore, but he carried it anyway. The instinct to present credentials to authority surviving even when authority had become meaningless. He also brought supplies, canned beans, bottled water, a first aid kit, items he'd gathered from his own home. I led him inside without hesitation. In 12 years of working across the border, I'd never seen Miguel as anything but reliable and professional. He was a man you could trust to do his job properly and to maintain basic decency while doing it. When everything else was becoming chaos, having someone you'd worked alongside for over a decade felt crucial to maintaining some sense of normalcy. Within 1 week, there were 17 of us at the checkpoint. They arrived in different ways, driven by similar instincts. People seeking shelter in a place that at least represented some form of structure. An engineer named David Chen from the Mexican administration building, who knew the facility's layout and infrastructure intimately. He'd worked maintenance for 8 years and understood how everything was connected. A nurse named James Reeves who'd been working at a clinic 10 miles north. Someone with actual medical training and knowledge that seemed invaluable now. A mechanic named Oscar Torres who'd been passing through when the roads became impassable and the world started ending. He'd been on his way to visit his mother in Mexico, a young man called Tyler. Couldn't have been more than 22 years old, who arrived with nothing but the clothes on his back and a story about watching his entire neighborhood get consumed by what he described as a flood. Except the flood was moving things and they were all screaming. A retired engineer named Robert Simmons who'd been living in a small house 3 miles away. A former teacher named Sarah Chen, no relation to David, who'd been working at the checkpoint as an administrative assistant. A woman named Patricia, who'd been a translator. A man named Vincent, who'd worked in construction. A teenager named Danny. Others came too, drawn by the same logic, seeking refuge in a place that offered structure, when structure had become rare. 17 people of various ages and backgrounds, united only by the fact that we'd all instinctively moved toward the checkpoint when everything else fell apart. By day 5, I stopped asking detailed questions and started taking actual inventory of what we had. The old world's protocols didn't matter anymore. Survival was the only protocol that remained relevant. I walked through the duty-free shops on both sides, cataloging supplies. American side had cases of water, canned vegetables, protein bars, coffee, energy drinks. Mexican side had similar supplies plus additional items. Tamales wrapped in plastic, dried beans, rice in bulk containers. We also found supplies in the administrative buildings, first aid kits, cleaning supplies, maintenance equipment. In the garage, Oscar discovered a fuel tank with approximately 500 gallons of diesel fuel and another 300 gallons of regular gasoline. If you've ever wondered what the moment feels like when you accept that the world you knew is actually ending, that you need to transform your understanding of what's possible and real, and that you're going to have to make decisions that would have been unthinkable yesterday, then you'll understand why I stopped treating this like a temporary crisis and started seeing it as permanent transformation. The realization came during night 2 when I was alone in the control room. I was listening to the radio, waiting for some communication that would indicate rescue was coming, and I finally accepted it never would. The networks were gone. The government was gone. Society had collapsed. This checkpoint, this place I'd worked for 12 years without really thinking about it, was now my entire world. If you're still watching, if you're starting to understand what happened here, you need to see how we transformed this place into something it was never meant to be. Like and subscribe right now, because what happens next shows what people are actually capable of when desperation becomes the only option available. The first priority was the vehicle barriers and gates. The checkpoint had been designed with a series of concrete obstacles and heavy metal gates specifically engineered to stop a vehicle attempting to cross at speed. I'd walked past them 1,000 times in 12 years without thinking about their actual function or design philosophy. Now they took on a completely different meaning. David Chen and I moved through the facility taking inventory, documenting every barrier, every gate, every access point. We systematized the barrier placement to create a coherent perimeter around the entire checkpoint complex. We positioned the heaviest obstacles at the main approaches, the North Road access and the South Road access. The gates, which had been controlled through an electronic system connected to the processing building, became physical choke points that we could lock and secure manually, using chains and heavy padlocks salvaged from the administrative storage areas. The processing building itself had small reinforced windows and walls built to specification during its original construction. The walls were concrete, at least 18 inches thick. The windows were narrow, designed more for observation than ventilation. We barricaded the windows using supplies we found: wooden pallets from the storage warehouse, heavy metal shelving units, concrete blocks, anything that would prevent line-of-sight access from outside. We maintained strategic observation ports that allowed visibility outward without exposing people inside. The guard towers, which had been designed for surveillance purposes in the normal operation of the checkpoint, became actual defensive positions. James Reeves pointed out that they provided elevated positioning and 360-degree sightlines, which, in the old world, was theoretical advantage for observation. In the new world, it was practical survival advantage. From the guard towers, you could see approaching threats from any direction. You could see for miles across the empty landscape. The duty-free shops on both the American and Mexican sides became the foundation of our supply system. Both sides maintained small retail spaces selling goods meant to symbolize cross-border commerce: bottled water, canned vegetables, protein bars, coffee, tobacco products, candy, magazines. The supplies weren't designed for long-term survival storage, but they bought us time. We did a careful inventory and calculated rationing schedules. If we were careful, maintained discipline, and didn't waste anything, we had perhaps 2 months of food supplies. Water wasn't immediately concerning because the checkpoint had a maintenance tank that had been kept full during operational years, holding approximately 5,000 gallons. Fuel for the generator was more limited. We siphoned what we could from abandoned vehicles on both sides of the border and stored it in containers secured behind the administrative building. The generator itself became critical infrastructure. Oscar Torres, the mechanic, worked with Tyler and me to establish a fuel management system. The generator powered the lights, which were crucial for nighttime visibility and psychological stability. More importantly, it powered the refrigeration unit, where James Reeves was storing medical supplies and any food that required temperature control. Oscar spent hours checking the equipment, rebuilding the fuel system, making sure everything would keep functioning. He approached the work with the methodical focus of someone who understood that failure meant death. He showed me how the generator worked, explained the fuel system, made me understand that we needed to be careful about consumption. The generator was a 50-kilowatt diesel unit, old but maintained. It could run continuously on the fuel we had for approximately 40 days if we ran it continuously. But we needed to be more economical than that. By day 15, we'd established routine structures, watch rotations, 2 people at any given time monitoring from the guard towers, positioned to see approach routes from both directions. 4 hours on, 4 hours off, rotating through all 17 of us. Food distribution schedules rationed carefully to stretch supplies as long as possible. We established portions, 1 can per person per day, supplemented with water and whatever fresh items we could preserve. Water conservation protocols. We'd discovered that the maintenance tank wasn't as full as we'd initially believed. The gauge was faulty and had been showing full when it was actually only 3/4 capacity. We needed to extend it. We implemented strict water conservation. No showers, rationed drinking water, reuse water for cleaning, fuel management. Oscar established strict protocols about generator usage, which hours it ran, how we monitored consumption. The generator ran from sunset to sunrise, giving us light and refrigeration during the hours we needed it most. During the day, we relied on natural light. Medical protocols. James organized the medical supplies and established quarantine procedures, never explicitly stating that we were all waiting to see if anyone would develop symptoms, but we all understood the unspoken agreement. The weird part wasn't the work itself, it was the moments in between the work. Those quiet hours when you'd suddenly realize that the world had actually ended and you were still thinking about whether the coffee supplies would last another week or whether the toilet in Building 3 was draining properly. Those moments were when the full weight of everything pressed down simultaneously, when you'd feel the strangeness of normalcy attempting to persist in the middle of apocalypse. We tried not to talk about what we'd lost. We tried to stay focused on what we had to accomplish right now, today, in this specific moment, in this specific place between 2 nations that no longer existed. But we couldn't help it sometimes. Sarah would mention her daughter in college. Robert would talk about his house in town. Patricia would speak about her husband who'd been in El Paso when things went bad. We'd listen and say nothing because what was there to say? Miguel threw himself into the security work with an intensity that made it clear something had shifted in him. He didn't say it directly, and I only found out by overhearing a conversation with David one night around 2 a.m. Miguel was up early, couldn't sleep, had come to help David inspect the barriers. His last call from his wife had come through before the networks completely collapsed. She was in Monterrey with their 2 kids, a daughter who was 11 and a son who was 9. He'd been trying to reach them for days, checking every communication method available, but the phone lines were dead. The internet was gone. After that realization, he channeled everything into making sure that our checkpoint was as secure as possible, that what had happened to his family wouldn't happen to anyone under our protection. He worked 18-hour days, checking barriers, fixing locks, reinforcing gates. His hands developed blisters and calluses. He didn't complain. On day 22. We saw them. They approached from the north in a group of 5, or what had been a group of 5 before things had gone wrong with their bodies. The way they moved was unmistakably wrong in ways that violated basic expectations of human locomotion. The movement was jerky and uncoordinated, like their joints weren't properly connected anymore, like the neural signals controlling their bodies were arriving with delay or corruption. One of them had a chunk of its torso completely exposed. Not fresh infection, but not ancient either. A state of decay that suggested the body should have ceased functioning weeks ago. But it kept moving. It kept searching. It kept existing despite every logical reason it should have stopped. The smell reached us before they got close. A stench of corruption that seemed to activate every warning system in your body simultaneously. Oscar and I were in the North Guard Tower when they became visible on the horizon. I heard Oscar's breathing stop, not a gasp or sharp intake of air, but a complete cessation, like his body had decided that any sound whatsoever could draw their attention. The creatures moved past the checkpoint in a loose formation, not directly toward it, just crossing through the landscape like they were following some pattern or searching for something that made sense to them, and nothing else. Their movement seemed almost methodical, purposeful, driven by logic that existed outside human reasoning. They seemed to be searching for something, tracking a scent or following an instinct. One of them turned its head toward our tower. I couldn't see if it had eyes anymore. Its face was too far gone, too decomposed. But I felt it looking at us. The sensation was almost physical, a pressure inside my chest that made my heart rate spike instantly, adrenaline flooding my system. Oscar grabbed my arm so hard I thought he might break the bone. We both stood perfectly still, not moving, barely breathing. After what felt like hours but was probably 30 seconds, maybe less, the creature turned away and continued moving with the others. They disappeared over the ridge to the south, moving toward the Mexican side of the border. We didn't speak for 20 minutes after they left. We just sat in the tower, processing what we'd seen. That night, I called an assembly. All 17 of us gathered in the processing building's main chamber, the space we designated for group meetings. I told them what Oscar and I had witnessed. I explained that the barriers and locked gates had moved from theoretical security measures to actual survival necessities. I told them that we were going to seal this place completely. No more coming and going. No more hoping for rescue from outside. No more maintaining the fiction that this was temporary. We were going to become isolated by choice, because isolation was the only option that meant survival. The room was silent. People exchanged looks. Then David spoke. We seal it, we're sealing our fate. We're deciding that whatever's out there, we're staying here. Yes, I said. That's exactly what we're deciding. He'd been in the detention cell for nearly 4 weeks at this point. We'd been bringing him food and water regularly, maintaining basic care, but no one had actually seen him in person since the first few days. I'm still not sure what I expected to find when I opened that cell door. Part of me was hoping he'd succumb to infection, that we could seal the cell and move on with less moral complexity. Death would have been simpler than what we actually found. He was alive, more alive than would have been reasonable to expect given his condition. The bite wound on his arm had gotten significantly worse, the skin around it developing a grayish pallor that spread like frost across his shoulder and down his entire right side. His breathing was different, deeper, more labored, like his lungs were having to work overtime to process something his body wasn't equipped to handle. His eyes were still his own, still Marcus Hendricks in that moment. But something else was happening underneath, something biological and wrong. "I'm not going to become one of them," he said before I could speak, his voice rough from disuse. "I've been fighting it, but I know what's happening. I can feel it, the way my thoughts are getting slower, the way I'm losing focus. It's like something else is taking over the basic functions. I need you to put me somewhere I can't hurt anyone." We moved him to the administrative building, to an office with a strong door that we could secure from outside. He asked for water and for someone to check on him every 12 hours. Beyond that, he asked for nothing. James checked on him regularly, brought him medications that probably didn't do anything but made us all feel like we were doing something meaningful, like we still had some control. The medications didn't matter in any practical sense. What mattered was that Marcus Hendricks, despite everything happening to his body, maintained enough of his humanity to ensure he didn't become a threat to the rest of us. By day 30, the barriers were reinforced, the gates were locked with heavy chains and multiple padlocks, and the checkpoint had become something I'd never intended it to be when I accepted this job 12 years ago. It was sealed, separate, a fortress, a place where the border that had once divided two nations now served an entirely different purpose, keeping the dead out instead of controlling the living. The supplies were holding reasonably well. Water wasn't an immediate problem because of the maintenance tank, though we'd implemented strict rationing protocols. Food was manageable if we remained disciplined about portions. Fuel was finite but carefully managed by Oscar, who'd established strict schedules about when the generator ran and which systems received power priority. We had shelter, defense, and the crucial psychological benefit of being together rather than alone, which mattered more than people who hadn't experienced isolation could understand. But on day 32, the first real test came. They came from the south, not the creatures we'd seen before, but people, living people who were moving with purpose and desperate urgency. A group of what looked like 30 or more individuals, streaming across the landscape from the direction of Mexico. They were running, genuinely running. And behind them we could hear the sounds, that croak scream that Marcus Hendricks had described. The sound of things that used to be human but weren't anymore, moving with corrupted intent and hunger. The group reached the southern gate of the checkpoint, and they started calling out. Spanish and English mixed together, voices overlapping, all of them calling for entry, telling us they were immune, they were safe, they just needed shelter. Behind them, the creatures were getting closer, and the group was getting more frantic. I could see people falling behind, being reached by the pursuing creatures, being consumed by them in ways I won't describe because some things can't be unseen once you've witnessed them. Miguel was at the southern gate. I watched him hesitate, his hand on the chain that secured it, understanding completely what the choice meant. Opening the gate would let in 30 people we'd never seen before, people we had no way to verify, people who might be infected and just hiding symptoms. Opening the gate would potentially compromise everything we'd built, everything we'd sacrificed to create. Closing the gate meant condemning 30 people to death. I made a decision that has haunted me since that moment, that I'm still struggling to justify, that I'm still not sure was right. I told him to open the gate. The decision came from something primal, not logic, not strategy, but something older. We were human, and humans shelter each other. Whatever the cost, whatever the risk, closing that gate would have meant becoming something other than human. I would rather have died than become the kind of person who could watch 30 people get consumed while standing behind locked barriers. We opened the gate. The rush was chaos. People poured through, desperate and terrified, carrying children, dragging wounded companions. Oscar and Tyler were positioned to start closing the gate again, but before they could get it fully shut, the creatures reached us. The first one came through the opening like a sprinter, moving with speed that shouldn't have been possible for a body in that state of decay. Tyler reacted instinctively, striking at it with a metal pipe, and the creature went down, its body crumpling but still moving, still reaching. David Chen and James Reeves were helping people through the gate, sorting them, moving them toward the buildings. More creatures were coming through now, too many to count, pushing against the barriers. The next 30 seconds were probably the most violent moment of my entire life. We fought the creatures at the gate. I had a crowbar. Oscar had a wrench. Tyler continued with the metal pipe. Miguel with a machete he'd grabbed from somewhere. The creatures didn't feel pain. They didn't stop coming. They just kept moving toward us, trying to push through, trying to reach the people we were protecting. One of them got its hands on Miguel's shoulder, and he didn't hesitate. He drove the machete through its skull with a focus that suggested he'd thought about this moment before, planned it out mentally. The skull split open, but the creature still moved, still reached, until David grabbed it and pulled it back, giving Miguel time to recover. We got the gate closed. It took 5 of us working together, fighting against the weight of creatures pushing against it, but we got it closed and locked. On the other side, the remaining creatures were pressing against the barriers, trying to get through, but the infrastructure held. The concrete barriers David had positioned held. We were now 50 people at the checkpoint. If you've ever had to choose between protecting yourself and protecting strangers, if you've ever faced a decision where both options meant accepting consequences you don't want to live with, then you understand why I made the call I made. And if you're still here, if you're still watching this far, then comment below and share this with someone who needs to know that people are capable of choosing compassion even when desperation is screaming at them to choose safety. Subscribe because what happens next shows what happens when you let hope override caution, when you decide that your humanity is worth more than your survival. Everything changed after that moment. The gate had barely clicked shut when the reality of what we'd done crashed down on all of us simultaneously. 50 people. We'd planned for maybe 20, stretched our supplies to cover 30 at the absolute maximum. 50 meant we'd cut our survival window in half. 50 meant we were now operating at critical capacity with almost no margin for error. The new arrivals were streaming into the processing building, soaked with sweat and blood. Not all of it their own. Some of them were crying. Some were in shock, staring at nothing, their eyes glazed over. A few were screaming about people they'd lost, people who'd fallen behind the group while running from the creatures. The sound of those screams, the raw desperation in them, was something that stayed with me through the following nights. I'd hear it in my dreams, that particular note of anguish that comes from watching someone you love get consumed. James Reeves immediately moved into medical protocol mode, establishing a triage station in the administrative building. He was checking people for bites, for signs of infection, for any indication that someone was already turning. This was the moment we'd all feared, the possibility that we'd let an infected person inside our fortress. One person, that's all it would take to end everything we'd built. One asymptomatic carrier, one person who didn't know they were turning, and our sealed sanctuary would become a tomb. The infection had a latency period. We'd learned from Marcus Hendricks that it could take several days for symptoms to manifest. That meant everyone who'd come through the gate in those final moments could be infected, and we'd have no way of knowing until transformation began. I watched James work for what felt like hours but was probably only 40 minutes. He was methodical, thorough, checking every person with the focus of someone who understood what was at stake. His hands were shaking, but his voice remained steady as he questioned each arrival. Where were they from? How long had they been running? Had they been bitten? Had they seen anyone bitten? When was the last time they ate? Did they have any symptoms? Fever, disorientation, cravings? He was asking about cravings because we'd discovered that one of the early signs of transformation was an unusual hunger, a desire for raw meat, for blood. The mind recognized something was wrong before the body began to obviously fail. The answers varied wildly. Some of the new arrivals had been living in Mexico City until 3 weeks ago, part of a settlement that had been overrun by creatures who'd migrated from the industrial areas. Others had come from smaller towns and villages throughout the border region, places we'd never heard of, towns that existed on no official maps. One man claimed to be a doctor from a hospital in Monterrey, but his credentials were questionable, and James noted the discrepancy. A woman said she'd been a farmer with her family until her entire village was overrun by what she described as a wave of death that moved through with purpose. A teenage girl couldn't speak coherently. She just kept repeating her brother's name over and over, a rhythmic chant that suggested her mind had retreated to a place we couldn't reach. An elderly man with a distinctive scar across his face kept muttering about how they'd failed, how they should have died with the others. His words suggesting survivor's guilt so deep that he seemed almost disappointed to still be alive. 3 of the new arrivals were children, a girl maybe 7 years old with dirt under her fingernails and terror in her eyes, a boy who was about 5 and barely spoke, and a teenager who looked to be around 16. Old enough to understand what had happened, but young enough that the understanding hadn't fully destroyed him yet. There was also a woman named Elena who seemed to be traveling with the children, though whether she was their mother or caretaker, or just someone who'd taken responsibility during the chaos wasn't immediately clear. She was protective of them, keeping them close, checking them frequently for injuries. The children changed something in the group dynamic fundamentally. Before they arrived, we'd been focused on survival logistics, on rationing and security and maintaining the infrastructure. But children activated a different part of human psychology, something primal and protective that overrode calculations about resource allocation. Suddenly it wasn't abstract anymore. We weren't just surviving, we were protecting someone's future. The little girl, her name was Isabella, reminded me of my own daughter, who was now somewhere else in a world that had ended. I'd been holding on to hope that she'd survived, that she'd found shelter somewhere, but the reality was becoming harder to maintain. The little boy, Marco, had lost his entire family in the initial outbreak, his mother, his father, his older sister. He'd been at school when everything started, and by the time the adults realized what was happening and tried to reunite families, his household had already been consumed. The teenager, Miguel Jr., was the son of one of our new arrivals, a man also named Miguel who'd apparently been searching for his son across multiple settlements before finally catching up with him here. By nightfall, James had cleared 48 of the 50 new arrivals. 2 people had clear signs of infection. One man who didn't realize he'd been bitten on the back of his neck, the bite wound hidden beneath his collar, and one woman whose fever was already reaching dangerous levels despite her insistence that she was fine, that she just needed rest. We had to make a decision. We couldn't let them inside the main facilities. We couldn't risk the infection spreading to the rest of us. But we also couldn't execute them. We weren't animals. We were still trying to maintain our humanity, even when circumstances were pushing us toward abandoning it. We set up an isolated quarantine area in one of the maintenance buildings, about 50 meters from the main checkpoint facility. It was separated enough to prevent contamination, but close enough that James could still check on them regularly, close enough that we could hear them if something went wrong. We brought them supplies, water, medications, blankets. We did everything we could to make their last days as comfortable as possible. The woman, whose name was Rosa, thanked us through tears. She understood what was happening to her. She'd watched her sister transform 3 days ago, and she'd felt the fever starting that morning. She knew the trajectory she was on. The man didn't say much, just sat in the corner of the maintenance building and stared at the wall with vacant eyes that suggested he'd retreated somewhere inside himself, some place where reality couldn't reach him. The decision to isolate them still haunts me. I understand the logic. I understand why we did it. But logic and humanity aren't always aligned. We were choosing survival for the group over compassion for the individuals. Every time I think about it, I remember that we're not supposed to make those choices. We're supposed to maintain our humanity even when it's convenient to abandon it. But we made the choice anyway, because the alternative was watching everyone die, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to live with that outcome. By day 35, we'd integrated the 48 new survivors into our checkpoint community. It was chaotic and complicated and exhausting. We had to establish new watch rotations, expand our food rationing from fixed schedules to flexible ones based on daily assessments of our supply levels, and essentially rebuild every system we'd established with 17 people to accommodate 65 people. The food rationing became the central challenge. We'd calculated that we had approximately 60 days of food at our current consumption rate with 17 people. But with 65 people, that timeline compressed to maybe 20 days. We needed to extend it drastically or find new food sources. The psychological toll was significant, too. We suddenly had survivors with fresh trauma, people who'd watched their families die in ways that left permanent marks on their psyches, people whose minds were broken by what they'd experienced. Some of them couldn't sleep and would pace the corridors at night, their footsteps echoing through the checkpoint facilities. Some of them wouldn't stop talking, as if silence would allow the horrors to catch up with them, as if keeping their mouths moving was somehow keeping death at bay. Others became catatonic, present physically but mentally absent, their eyes open but seeing nothing, responding to questions with only vacant stares. David Chen worked with Oscar to expand our fuel management system. We were now using more fuel than we'd anticipated, and the generator was running almost constantly to meet the increased demand for refrigeration, lighting, and heating. Oscar showed me the calculations. He'd written them down in a notebook with precise handwriting, each number representing our remaining survival time. At our current consumption rate, we had maybe 30 days of fuel remaining. After that, we'd be rationing to essential systems only, which meant losing refrigeration, losing most of our lighting, losing climate control, losing the generator's ability to maintain the checkpoint's environmental infrastructure. I made the decision to reduce generator usage to essential systems only, effective immediately. We had enough lighting from natural sunlight during the day, at least during the warmer months. We could use kerosene lamps at night if necessary. We'd found supplies in the administrative building's storage areas. The refrigeration would stay on for medications and critical food storage. Everything else would need to be managed differently. It was a gamble. It meant less comfort, less security, more reliance on rationing and strict protocols. But it extended our fuel runway from 30 days to approximately 60 days, maybe longer if we were extremely careful and if nothing unexpected happened. The water situation became more complicated than we'd anticipated. With nearly 70 people now at the checkpoint, our water consumption had nearly tripled from what we'd originally calculated. The maintenance tank that had seemed so substantial weeks ago was now emptying at an alarming rate. We had maybe 3 weeks of water left at current consumption levels, assuming we didn't face any emergency situations that required additional water for medical purposes or sanitation. I worked with Daniel and David to establish a water conservation protocol that was strict to the point of being uncomfortable. 2 liters per person per day for all purposes, including drinking, cooking, and minimal washing. It was the minimum we could sustain on before dehydration became a critical problem. I called another assembly, this time with a larger group and significantly more tension in the room. The atmosphere was different from our previous meetings. Before, we'd been frightened but united. Now there was a hint of fracture, of different interests, of people wondering if they'd made a mistake by staying. I explained the situation plainly. We had limited resources, and we needed to make hard choices about how to use them. I proposed implementing a strict regime, rationed food at 800 calories per person per day, rationed water at 2 liters per person per day, generator usage reduced to 6 hours daily during essential times, early morning for initial operations and evening for critical systems, no non-essential activity, and mandatory work assignments for able-bodied people. The reactions were mixed. Some people understood and accepted the reality, with the kind of resignation that comes from understanding that resistance is futile. Others started to panic, asking questions about what would happen if the supplies ran out. What happened then? One man who'd arrived in the new group, a banker named Robert from Mexico City, started arguing that we should prioritize the established members, that the new arrivals were consuming resources that could be better used. His logic was mathematical and cold. Fewer people would mean longer survival for the remaining people. Miguel stood up and confronted him directly, his voice sharp with anger that surprised everyone. We all made the choice to let them in. We don't get to change that now. We don't get to decide that their lives are worth less because they arrived later. The room went quiet. Miguel had become one of our de facto leaders through his work ethic and his moral clarity. When he spoke, people listened. We survive together, or we don't survive at all. The moment we start choosing who deserves to live, we've become something other than human. Robert sat down. He didn't apologize, but he accepted the decision. Over the next few days, we discovered that 3 of the new arrivals had significant medical training. A woman named Dr. Patricia had been a surgeon in Mexico City before the outbreak, before she'd fled the city when the military cordons had failed. A man named Dr. Luis had worked in emergency medicine in a smaller hospital. A nurse named Sophia had worked in intensive care and had experience with trauma management. James was visibly relieved to have additional medical support, and they immediately began working together to inventory our medical supplies and establish protocols for handling medical emergencies. With 3 additional medical professionals, we could establish better triage procedures, better training for the rest of us in basic medical procedures. One of the new arrivals, a man named Daniel, who was in his late 20s and had worked as a solar technician before everything collapsed, approached me on day 38 with an idea that shifted our entire understanding of what was possible. He'd noticed that the checkpoint had several buildings with exposed roof space that faced south, and with the right materials and setup, he believed he could potentially install solar panels to supplement our power needs. It wouldn't replace the generator, but it could extend our fuel and provide backup power for critical systems. I authorized him to proceed, mostly because I had nothing to lose and everything to gain. We scavenged materials from the administrative buildings, stripped copper wiring, gathered anything that could be repurposed. Oscar helped him understand the electrical systems. David helped him plan the installation. It was a long shot. Solar panels on a checkpoint in Texas would be decent but not amazing. But it was better than nothing. It was hope in the form of practical action, and hope was becoming increasingly valuable. 3 weeks later, the first tomatoes were sprouting in our makeshift greenhouse, and Daniel's solar array was feeding power back into our electrical system. The generator usage dropped significantly. We were now running it only 4 hours a day instead of 6. The fuel runway extended again, buying us more time. By day 40, we had a functioning solar array on the roof of the processing building and 3 additional tomato plants in our greenhouse, along with lettuce, herbs, and root vegetables that David had managed to get growing in containers. It wasn't powerful enough to replace the generator completely, but it was enough to handle daytime power needs and charge battery banks that could power critical systems at night. It extended our fuel runway once again, buying us more time. A few more days, a few more weeks, perhaps even more if everything worked perfectly. The real problem came on day 43. Rosa died. We found her that morning in the maintenance building, where we'd isolated her. She'd succumbed to the infection during the night, her body unable to fight the viral transformation. James had gone to check on her at 6 in the morning. We'd established a protocol of checking on her every 4 hours, and found her lying on the cot, no longer breathing, her body already beginning to show the signs of transformation. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor. Her eyes were slightly open, staring at nothing. Her mouth was slightly agape. The question was what to do with her body. We couldn't risk burying her near the checkpoint facilities. The ground might contaminate our water supply or create other problems we hadn't anticipated. We couldn't leave her in the isolation building. The smell of decay would become a problem within hours, and the psychological weight would be significant. We couldn't leave her exposed outside the gate that was asking for it to attract creatures to our perimeter. We held a funeral of sorts. It was simple and quiet, performed with the kind of gravity that comes from recognizing that we were witnessing the end of a human life, the ending of a person who'd lived and loved and mattered, even though we'd known her for only a few days. We wrapped her in blankets we could spare and carried her to the southern perimeter near the gate. We said a few words. Miguel spoke about not knowing her, but respecting her courage and accepting her fate with dignity. David spoke about how she'd helped other refugees by not panicking, by accepting the quarantine without resistance, by maintaining her humanity even as her body was failing. Patricia spoke about the medical aspects of what had happened, trying to extract knowledge from the experience that might help us treat other infections. Then we laid her remains in an area beyond the barriers, but visible from the checkpoint. A memorial to what we'd lost, a physical reminder of the cost of survival. That night, I heard Rosa screaming. Not Rosa herself. She was long past screaming. What I heard was the sound she was making in her new form. The transformation had taken complete hold, and she'd risen again as one of them. We heard the noise from the guard tower, that distinctive croak scream, but different somehow. Anguished, like some part of Rosa was still conscious and aware inside that transformed body, screaming silently at what had become of her. The sound was worse than any creature we'd heard before, because we knew who it was. We knew what it had been. We knew that Rosa was somewhere inside that body, trapped and dying forever. We didn't go out to confront it. There was nothing we could do. Miguel volunteered to watch from the tower and record what happened, to understand the creatures better. We needed to know if transformed individuals retained any memory, any coherence, any ability to coordinate. Rosa, or what Rosa had become, wandered the perimeter for several hours, moving in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. She tested the barriers. She approached the gate. She moved with what looked like purpose, with intention. Eventually, she seemed to lose interest and moved away toward the Mexican side, disappearing into the distance. The other isolated person, the man with the bite on his neck, was showing advanced signs of transformation. His fever had spiked to 104 degrees despite our best efforts. James was trying everything: antibiotics that probably did nothing against a viral infection, pain management, hydration, trying to keep him comfortable. We all knew he was going to follow Rosa's path. He was going to transform, and we were going to have to listen to it happen. If you're still with me, if you've made it this far into understanding what we were dealing with, then you understand why people do desperate things when facing extinction. When your choices are reduced to impossible options. When every decision carries the weight of life and death. When you're watching your humanity being tested against survival instinct. That's when you understand the gravity of everything. Comment below and tell me you understand the weight of these choices. Share this with someone who needs to know that survival isn't just about resources or defense. It's about maintaining your humanity while surrounded by inhumanity. Subscribe, because what happens next shows the moment when we stopped being refugees and started becoming something else entirely. We needed to establish better understanding of our environment. I tasked David and Daniel with creating a detailed mapping system of the checkpoint and the surrounding area, using materials we had available. We needed to know where the creatures congregated, where they moved, what patterns they followed. Understanding their behavior might give us strategic advantages. We established observation protocols, specific people watching at specific times, recording what they saw, noting patterns in a journal we kept in the guard tower. We were trying to apply scientific methodology to the problem of our survival. Over the next week, we discovered that the creatures seemed most active at dusk and dawn. During the heat of the day, they moved less, seemed to shelter in shade or in the wreckage of destroyed vehicles. At night, they became more active again, moving through the landscape with what seemed like purpose. They moved in loose groups but didn't seem to coordinate effectively. Occasionally, larger groups would gather, sometimes as many as 20 or 30 creatures in one place, but these seemed temporary. The creatures would scatter after several hours, without any apparent reason. The most disturbing discovery came when we observed multiple creatures returning to the same location repeatedly. Near the southern perimeter, there was an area of destroyed vehicles and scattered bodies, the remnants of the refugee group that hadn't made it through the gate. The creatures kept returning to this area, moving among the wreckage. David theorized that they might be responding to the presence of uninfected bodies, drawn by something they could sense. If that was true, it meant they retained some hunting behavior, some predatory logic. It meant they weren't mindless. They were predators, just with a different mode of operation than we understood. On day 47, the second isolated man transformed. Like Rosa, he rose as one of them. Unlike Rosa, he seemed more organized, more focused, his movements more deliberate. He moved directly to the southern gate and began testing it, pushing against it with surprising force, trying to manipulate the locking mechanism. For several hours, we watched him struggle with the gate from the tower. Miguel was observing and reporting what he saw. The creature seemed frustrated, almost deliberately trying to solve the gate problem. It would push against the gate, then move to the lock, then try to find gaps in the barrier. Eventually, it gave up and moved away. but not before we'd made a crucial realization. The fact that it had tried, that it had approached the gate with what seemed like purpose, with problem-solving logic, that changed our understanding of the threat fundamentally. These things retained some cognitive function. They weren't mindless. They were still dangerous in ways we hadn't fully appreciated. They could think, they could plan, they could learn. The man who'd argued about resource allocation, Robert, came to me on day 48 with an idea that surprised me. His name was Robert, and he'd been an architect before everything collapsed. He proposed expanding our defensive infrastructure, creating barriers within the checkpoint itself, establishing isolated zones that could be sealed off independently. His logic was sound from a tactical perspective. If we divided the checkpoint into sections, we could potentially contain an outbreak without losing the entire facility. We could retreat to progressively more secure areas if needed. It made sense strategically. It also made sense psychologically. Having internal barriers, knowing that we could retreat to a fortified secondary position, gave people a sense of security they'd been lacking. It gave us redundancy, a backup plan, a way to survive even if one section of the checkpoint was compromised. We divided the checkpoint into 3 zones. The processing building was Zone A, our primary living and administrative space where the majority of our people stayed. The administrative building complex was Zone B, our secondary living area, and medical facility where James and the other medical professionals had established their workspace. The maintenance and fuel storage areas were Zone C, our resource core, the most critical part of our survival infrastructure. Heavy doors were installed at strategic points between zones using materials salvaged from the checkpoint's emergency systems. These could be sealed and locked, creating separate defensive positions if necessary. The work took days, nearly a week of continuous effort. Everyone participated within their capability. The children helped where they could, carrying smaller items and working on tasks suited to their age and strength. The elderly contributed what they were able. Oscar and Robert worked together to plan the barrier placements with engineering precision. Sarah coordinated the work schedules. It was construction, and construction was something concrete, something that could be accomplished with effort and focus. It gave people purpose and occupation. It was good for morale. By day 50, we'd settled into a new routine. The checkpoint had become a functioning community, not comfortable, not safe by any previous standard, but organized and structured. We had work assignments, water collection duties, food preparation rotations, guard schedules. We had education time where the teacher, Sarah, worked with the children on reading and mathematics, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy and development. We had meditation time in the evenings, when people would gather quietly, not speaking, just existing together in shared silence. The food situation remained critical. Our rationing was holding reasonably well, but we were consuming supplies faster than we'd anticipated. Oscar and Daniel worked together to establish a more sophisticated greenhouse inside one of the administrative buildings, using materials salvaged from the checkpoint facilities. We weren't going to be able to grow enough to sustain 70 people completely, but anything we could grow would extend our supplies, would add variety to our diet, would provide psychological benefits beyond just nutrition. They planted seeds we found in storage, seeds that had been in the checkpoint's emergency supplies, salvaged soil from outside the barriers that we carefully tested for contamination, and set up irrigation using recycled water from cleaning operations. It was complicated and required trial and error, but within weeks we had lettuce growing, tomatoes sprouting, and herbs that could supplement our meals. 3 weeks later, the first tomatoes were sprouting in our greenhouse. and Daniel's solar array was feeding consistent power back into our electrical system. I stood in front of the greenhouse looking at those small green tomatoes growing from vines, and I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. It sounds like a small thing. Tomatoes growing in a greenhouse at an abandoned border checkpoint while the world ended outside. But it represented something crucial. It represented the future. It represented the possibility that we could sustain ourselves, that we could create something beyond pure survival. It represented hope in a tangible, growing form. On day 60, we heard vehicles. Everyone froze. Vehicles meant something. It meant either rescue or it meant new danger. We hadn't heard engines since the early days. The creatures couldn't operate vehicles. This was something else entirely. We moved to observation positions and waited, every muscle tense, every breath shallow. The vehicles approached from the north, a convoy of 3 military trucks, olive drab in color, clearly military transport. They had survivors in them, people in uniform, people who represented authority in a world where authority had essentially ceased to exist. I felt something in my chest, relief mixed with something else, something complicated. They pulled up to the northern gate, and soldiers emerged with weapons held at ready position, tactical gear, military precision. An officer approached the gate and called out, "This is Major Christopher Hayes, United States Army. We're establishing survivor camps and fortified positions throughout the region. We're here to confirm your status and integrate you into the military protection network." I should have felt relief. This was rescue. This was outside help arriving. This was the cavalry coming to save the settlement. But I felt something else, something territorial. We'd built this place. We'd survived here. We'd made impossible choices and kept each other alive. We transformed this checkpoint from a barrier into a sanctuary. And now someone was arriving to tell us what to do, to bring us under military command, to potentially disrupt everything we'd established. I opened the gate myself, and Major Hayes entered with his team. The military personnel entered with weapons raised, moving with tactical precision developed through training and protocol. They quickly assessed the checkpoint, counted our people, reviewed our supplies, established perimeter security. Major Hayes was professional and competent, the kind of officer who'd been trained to take charge of situations. He explained that the outbreak had been significantly worse in urban areas, that the military was establishing supply lines and defensive networks in rural areas to consolidate survivors and resources. He offered us protection, military personnel stationed at our facility. He offered us supplies, food, ammunition, medical equipment. He offered us coordination with other survivor groups, integration into a larger military structure. It was everything we should have wanted. It was rescue. It was hope from an outside source. It was the return of civilization and order. But as he talked, as I listened to him explain the military command structure, the integration protocols, the chain of command, I realized something important. With military protection came military hierarchy. With the military came the potential for conscription, for our people being separated, for our choices being taken away. With military control came the loss of our autonomy, the loss of the community we'd built, the loss of the identity we'd established. I made another decision that I'm still uncertain about, a decision that I question even now. I told Major Hayes that we appreciated the offer, that we understood the value of military protection and coordination. But I explained that we preferred to maintain our independence. I explained that we had established sustainable systems, that we had competent people managing critical functions, and that integration into a larger military structure might compromise our stability. I told him that we'd survived this long by making our own decisions, and we wanted to continue doing that. He was surprised. He argued the point with military logic. He explained that going it alone was dangerous, that we needed military protection from roving creatures and potentially hostile survivor groups. He explained that the military networks could provide supplies that we couldn't obtain independently. But I held firm, even as part of me wondered if I was making a terrible mistake. We are protected, I said. We built this protection ourselves. We've chosen to survive together, on our own terms. We're not coming with you. After 30 minutes of negotiation, him presenting logical arguments, me presenting ideological ones, he agreed to leave supplies, cases of canned food, medical equipment, ammunition, fuel, and to mark us as established on their records. If we ever needed military assistance, we could call, but they would respect our independence. They left that afternoon, their vehicles disappearing over the northern horizon, leaving behind supplies and the knowledge that we'd chosen isolation over integration. As their vehicles disappeared over the horizon, I felt Miguel place a hand on my shoulder. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. "Whatever comes, we did that together." But I wasn't sure. I'm still not sure. That decision haunts me as much as the decision to open the gate did. I second-guess it constantly. Was I being wise, or was I being foolish? Was I protecting our autonomy, or was I condemning us? Did I make the right choice? Over the next weeks, we established trading relationships with other survivor groups, communities that had formed in nearby towns, settlements that had been established by people with similar ingenuity and determination. Daniel and David ventured out cautiously to nearby settlements, traveling during daylight hours, moving carefully through the landscape. We traded our surplus tomatoes and other garden produce for things we needed: ammunition for our weapons, medical supplies beyond what we had, technical equipment that could help us improve our systems. We learned that there were other fortified positions in the region, other people who'd survived, other communities trying to maintain existence in the aftermath of civilization. Communication between settlements became crucial. We established radio contact with other communities, sharing information about creature movements, about which areas were dangerous, about supply sources. We learned that there were at least 5 other major settlements within 50 miles of our checkpoint, each with different approaches to survival, each managing their own crisis. And then, on day 85, something unexpected happened. People from the Mexican side started arriving, not as refugees fleeing creatures, but as people seeking to establish trade, seeking to meet with the community at the checkpoint that had become known in survivor networks as neutral ground. The checkpoint, which had once divided nations, was beginning to unite them. Word had spread through the survivor networks that we had food, that we had medical supplies, that we had technology. More importantly, word had spread that we treated people with dignity, regardless of their origin. We established markets on designated days. On Tuesdays and Fridays, survivors from both sides would gather at the checkpoint. They would trade goods, share information, discuss survival strategies. The barrier that had once meant division now meant something entirely different. It meant a place where both sides could meet safely, where commerce could happen, where communities could connect. David had an idea. Instead of viewing the checkpoint as a fortress designed to divide, we could reimagine it as a meeting point designed to unite. We expanded the processing building, created formal trading areas with tables and organization, established protocols for safe exchange of goods. We created administrative positions, people responsible for managing trades, recording transactions, maintaining order. We established currency systems based on useful goods, ammunition, fuel, medicine, food. We developed frameworks for dispute resolution, using Miguel as our primary mediator, a role he accepted with the understanding that he was helping to create something larger than himself. The checkpoint transformed. It went from being a refugee shelter to being something more significant, a trading hub, a neutral zone, a place where survivor communities could connect and support each other. The border that no longer meant anything because the nations it had divided no longer existed became the center point of everything. By day 100, we had established what we called the Border Sanctuary, a fortified trading post that connected survivor communities, that provided neutral ground for exchange. That represented the possibility that borders could unite rather than divide when the nations they separated ceased to exist. We had solar power providing clean energy. We had sustainable food production from our greenhouse. We had clean water through careful conservation and recycling. We had medical facilities with trained medical professionals. We had established security protocols that protected everyone equally. We had community governance based on consensus and mutual benefit. We had mutual support systems that meant no one was abandoned. The transformation was complete. What started as a desperate attempt to survive had become something revolutionary. A border that had been designed to keep people apart was now designed to bring them together. The checkpoint that had been engineered to control movement now controlled nothing and enabled everything. I still think about the people who didn't make it. Rosa screaming in her transformed state, the man with the bite on his neck, transforming into something other than human. Marcus Hendricks, who'd arrived at day 1 and transformed on day 34, despite our efforts to save him. The families that were lost. The world that ended. The life I had before that's now gone forever. But I also think about what we built from the rubble of that ending. We proved something that the old world had forgotten. When everything else falls away, when survival becomes the only priority, humans can choose compassion. We can choose community. We can choose to transform symbols of division into symbols of connection. We can choose hope over despair, unity over isolation, humanity over mere survival. The creatures still wander beyond our barriers. The world is still broken. The solar panels still need maintenance and the garden still requires work. And we still have to be careful about every resource. But inside the checkpoint, we've created something that works. We've created sanctuary. We've created a place where people from both sides of a border can meet as equals. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all we can ask for when civilization has ended and the world has transformed into something unrecognizable. Maybe survival isn't the goal anymore. Maybe the goal is to create something worth surviving for. Maybe that's the real victory.